It's great to welcome to the program today Tim Maudlin, who's the founder and director of the John Bell Institute for the Foundations of Physics and also professor of philosophy at New York University. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get into metaphysics a little bit and give some in our audience some tools with which to understand this concept. Very often people on the internet love making videos about metaphysics and they seem to have no idea what we're even talking about. So one analogy that I've used, and you tell me whether this gets us in the right direction. If we want to understand how the moon got to exist and where it is, gravity would be part of understanding that. Metaphysics would look at how did gravity get created? Was there a before gravity? Is that an example of what we talk about when we say physics versus metaphysics?
Well, unfortunately, just the language, physics and metaphysics, makes it sound like what you just said, and
Yes.
maybe a lot of people use it that way. Historically, that's not what it is at all.
Okay.
Metaphysics, there was a document that came down to us from Aristotle that a later editor called the Metaphysics. Aristotle never used the term. And what he's doing in that is looking at what we call ontology, or just the general theory of what exists, carried out at the most general high level scale, right? So not, gee, is there a rock over here? But are there rocks at all? And what are rocks made of? So from that point of view, it's not that you go beyond physics to do metaphysics. I actually have a book called The Metaphysics Within Physics, because physics makes postulates about, at a fundamental level, what exists. That's part of metaphysics. Now, maybe not everything is physical, so metaphysics would go further than that if they're non-physical things, but part of it is just the basic picture of what exists physically. Now, if gravity exists physically, okay, yeah, gravity is part of it. Is there a story about where gravity came from? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe that's just kind of ground level stuff. Once you get down to the law of gravity, there's no further account of that. That's the bottom level of everything.
When we think about things like the relationship between mind and body, which can have religious aspects to the discussion, scientific, philosophical, consciousness, free will, these sorts of things. Are these all conversations that include both what we might consider traditional hard science as well as metaphysics, or are they only that depending on the preconceived notions one brings to the conversation?
No, I mean, the sorts of questions you're asking, certainly the mind-body problem, uh, involves fundamental metaphysical questions. If you think there is a non-physical soul, some people do, some people don't. If you do, then there's an issue of how it can interact with a physical body, right? And that the interaction would have to go both ways. If you think there isn't, then you have to say, well, how is it that just physical stuff doing something could give rise to consciousness and awareness? That's a very deep problem as well. So there's no easy answers here. There are different answers, and each answer kind of involves its own questions that run on from it. So yeah, I mean, metaphysics certainly gets involved in those kinds of questions.
When I've talked to scientists about the question, what was there before the universe? Answers obviously are always couched in we don't actually know, but one question is, was there really a before the universe? Which is a hard thing to think about, because it seems, if you understand time linearly, that there must have been some before, some beginning, or something like that. What does metaphysics have to add to that question?
Well, it's not that metaphysics is going to ride to the rescue and, and provide answers to this. I mean, the questions you ask, again, are good questions. Is there anything before, let's say, this universe?
Mm.
Now, one possible answer to that is, yeah, there was another universe, and before that, maybe another one, and before that, maybe another, and then there's a question of how one arises out of another. Maybe you say, as you say, one possible answer is, look, there was no before this universe. And that might be because time goes on forever, or it might be that time doesn't even go on forever, but nonetheless, there's only so much of it. There's only a limited amount. This is the kind of standard Big Bang theory. You go back 13.7 billion years, and there is nothing before that. So it's not that that came out of anything earlier. There was no earlier. These are different answers, right? And cosmologists have proposed different theories that answer these questions in different ways. It's not as if metaphysicians have some magic wand that they're going to give you the right answer. If you're well trained in philosophy, you can at least delineate, look, there's this answer, there's this answer, there's this answer. Let's see how they differ. Let's see what observations might bear on this and questions like that.
I think one of the areas where lay people sometimes come up against, I don't know if frustration or despair or existential crises is the right term, but with some of these questions, what becomes tough is that it can seem as though you either have to say, I'm going to try to answer some of these questions simply with science because that's the only place where the scientific method exists, and that's all I'm comfortable with in terms of confidence in what we either know or don't know, or I have to look at a different path altogether, which would be philosophy, metaphysics, etc. And that can be frustrating because some people feel like I'm kind of pre-selecting where the endpoint for me is going to be in some of these questions by choosing one of these two paths, almost like a fork in the road. Is that an understandable frustration? But more importantly, is it an accurate critique or observation, maybe is the right word?
So I think you have something particular in mind there, and let me just point it out. Because you say, oh, there's the scientific way, and then there are other ways.
Well, I'm saying if someone feels that way, are they right, or is that not the right interpretation or understanding?
Well, the first thing I would say is sort of any discipline where you provide what we think as good reasons to believe what you're proposing counts as a kind of science. Sometimes that's experimental or observational, but notice when we divide the university into the arts and sciences, the math department's in the sciences, right?
Yes.
Not because it works on observations, but because it works by arguments, by proofs, right? You say, look, I have a reason that I can give to you for accepting this answer. From that point of view, anything that really has good evidence, anybody that's putting forward good evidence for what they're claiming is doing science, whatever else you call it. And if something doesn't count as science, then you're just saying, well, I'm putting forward opinions and I have no good reasons for them. And I would say, well, that's not such a great thing to do. Now, there are limits to science. There may be things that you'd like to know that we're just not in a position to know. And if there are, there are. I mean, you just have to live with the limitations of the world.
What are, in your mind, some of the most interesting questions or problems that are being looked at in terms of metaphysics and philosophy right now that may be familiar to our audience or may not be?
Well, since I specialize in foundations of physics, the one you mentioned, like is there a beginning to the entire universe, cosmos? And if so, what was it like? And could there be anything that we would count as an explanation for why it was like that? I think that's a very interesting question. There are much more detailed questions about how to understand quantum theory, what picture of the world that you can really comprehend could result in the kind of phenomena we see in the lab that we associate with quantum theory. They're very interesting. I mean, I could go into detailed questions there, but I'm sure that would take us beyond the scope of this interview. But I work in foundations of physics, so of course, I tend to those. There are people who are worried about how did life begin, right? That's how could living things have come out of non-living things? And that's a very interesting question. I mean, and I've heard interesting answers having to do with how clay forms and various kind of inorganic structures that could help create the sorts of complexity that we need for life and so on. That would be in biology an interesting question. So there are lots of them in different places. I happen to live in the physics part of it.
I recently read a couple of books about solipsism, and one of the claims that all of these books made was that, unlike with many other philosophies of reality and time, there's been no satisfactory refutation of the idea that all we can really be certain of is our own existence right now as we are thinking about it. That even our memories that we believe we have experienced, we may not actually have experienced them. They may have been implanted in our brains as you and I are speaking today. In other words, I don't know that I really had an apple an hour ago. I have the memory of having had that apple, and that there's been no satisfactory refutation of that. Doesn't mean that it is true. To choose this when it comes to thinking about time and the passage of time, etc. What does someone who does the work you do think about such an assertion?
Well, let me just check, because there's a little linguistic question I have. You said you read books about solipsism. Did you mean that or skepticism? Because it sounded like you were raising.
I meant solipsism.
You meant solipsism. Well, solipsism is a view. It's a very definite view. It sort of says the only thing that exists is me. I mean, okay, that's a possible view. It's kind of crazy, right? I mean, there's so much
even someone like you is comfortable refuting it by saying it's kind of crazy.
Well, you would say, if you want by a refutation an absolute proof, you're not going to get it.
Okay.
But it's not that the solipsist has an absolute proof of any sort that solipsism is true. So you can't give that standard to your enemies. You say, you enemies, you have to prove your case beyond any doubt. And me, I can just say whatever I want, right?
So it's a question of burden of proof in a sense.
So, solipsism, I mean, the view that only I exist, I think has literally nothing to say for it. Of course, there are things other than me. There are tables and chairs. And if I leave the room, as Hume would say, if I leave the room and the fire is burning and I come back later, it's a bunch of ashes. Why? Because it kept burning all the time when I wasn't there. I mean, that's the obvious explanation. It's not, you can say I could make up, maybe I'm in the Matrix, maybe there's some ETs. You can always make up stuff.
Yes.
But there's no reason to believe the stuff you make up. And there's the whole picture we have of the physical universe hangs together and allows you to make predictions and explain a lot of stuff that requires there to be more than just me. So I would say all the evidence is in favor of it not being just me, and none of the evidence. Now, it's not an absolute proof. Okay, so you're just asking too much for an absolute proof. Reasonable people don't demand absolute proof. They adjust their beliefs to where the weight of the evidence is. Right.
With many of these questions, I've asked folks like Lawrence Krauss, for example, about it and others. Do you believe that it's a matter of time until we answer some of these toughest questions, or do you think it's possible that they will never be answered?
I think both. You have to be prepared for both outcomes, because we don't have the resources to answer that. The best we can say is that, people sometimes say, look, human intelligence evolved among ape-like creatures on the savannah. It allowed them to survive. It gave enough intelligence to deal with that world. What makes you think that makes you smart enough or have the right kind of intelligence to deal with questions of cosmology or whatever? On the other hand, you certainly have to say, well, we've done awfully well. I mean, we've extended science down to microscopic and subatomic scales and to cosmological scales, and we understand a lot about galaxy formation and everything. So certainly our intellectual abilities go far beyond what we needed just in order to survive. How far will they take us? Will they take us to an end, as it were, theory that's just the right theory that always makes the right predictions, or will we get stuck? I don't know. I mean, the only way to find out is to push forward, right? The only way to find out is to figure out what we don't know now and investigate the possible ways to go forward and push as hard as you can. To make a prediction about whether we'll succeed or not, I guess I tend to be kind of optimistic, but that's just a character trait of mine. That's not an argument.
I share that cautious optimism that at some point, what are the timescales we're thinking of, though, I think is where it becomes a tougher question. We've been speaking with Tim Maudlin, who is a professor of philosophy at New York University. You have an ongoing project you wanted to mention as well. Is that right?
Yes, I did, just since I have people's attention. If you're interested in these issues, I am the founder and director of the John Bell Institute for the Foundations of Physics. We are at the moment trying to raise money on a GoFundMe to buy a location where we can exist physically. So if anybody would like to help us out, we would appreciate any help you can give us. You can just Google John Bell Institute to our website or the GoFundMe John Bell Institute, and it would come up.
That's johnbellinstitute.org as the website.
Yes.
Tim Maudlin, really appreciate your time and insights today. Thank you.
Thank you.